In the early afternoon in Key West, Florida, in the first years of the 20th century, the light comes off the water in a way that makes everything look slightly older than it is. The harbor a few blocks from Eaton Street carries the smell of salt and rope and engine oil. The streets are wide and shaded by strangler fig and mahogany, and the wooden houses along them have high ceilings and louvered windows designed to let the Gulf wind pass through without invitation. On a particular afternoon in or around the year 1904, a small boy is carrying something up a wooden staircase inside a large Victorian house at the far end of one of those streets. The thing he is carrying is almost as tall as he is. It is dressed as he is dressed, in a white sailor suit. He is taking it to the room at the top of the house, the round room in the turret, where the window looks out over the street and the harbor light comes through the glass in the late afternoon in long, warm bars. The boy's name from that afternoon forward will be Gene. The house at 534 Eaton Street is still standing. It has the particular quality of Victorian construction in Florida, which is lighter and taller and more open to the air than its counterparts in New England or the Midwest, designed for heat rather than cold, for breezes rather than storms. The wraparound porch on the ground floor is the kind of porch that was built for sitting on through the long subtropical evenings. The upper floors are reached by interior staircases, and at the top, where the roof line turns into something like a small tower, there is a round room with a window that faces the street. That room is where the story begins, in the sense that most stories about rooms begin, not with anything that happened there yet, but with the room existing and waiting, and the light coming through the glass at the right angle at the right time of day. The family who owned the house was called Otto. Thomas Otto was a physician in Key West, a man of professional standing, whose household at 534 Eaton Street placed him and his family among the more prominent residents of a city that had for much of the preceding century been the wealthiest in Florida. The Eaton Street home was not a modest residence. It was large enough to have a servant or two, large enough to have a room at the top that a child could claim as entirely his own, large enough that the upper floors existed in a kind of mild separation from the social life of the ground floor below. Thomas and his wife had a son. The son was born in 1900. He was given the name Robert, after the family surname's tradition of first names, and for the first few years of his life, that was what he was called. Then, around the age of 4, he received a doll. The doll was large for a stuffed toy. Standing approximately 40 inches tall, it occupied a significant portion of the physical space available to a small child. It was close to the height of the child himself, which is one of the first things that people who encounter the documented history of the doll find themselves returning to. A toy that stands beside a 4-year-old at roughly his own height is not a passive object in a toy chest. It is something more like a companion, something more like a counterpart. The doll was stuffed with excelsior, which is the curled wood shaving material historically used in packing and as filling for stuffed toys in that era, and its exterior was cloth, its features hand-stitched in the manner of fine German doll-making of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Its eyes were glass buttons. Its face had the slight asymmetry that comes from stitching cloth over a rounded form by hand, not symmetrical in the way a machine might produce, but considered, careful, the result of attention paid to making something that would last. The doll wore a white sailor suit. The boy, when he received the doll, was often dressed in a white sailor suit. The visual pairing has been noted by researchers and museum staff at the Fort East Martello Museum, where the doll now resides. The two of them, the child and the toy, dressed in matching clothes, as though they had been coordinated deliberately, as though whoever gave the doll to the child had wanted to make them look like each other, whether that was the intention or simply the result of the fashion for small boys' clothing at the time. Sailor suits were the dominant mode of dress for young children in affluent households across the Western world in the early 1900s. The effect is the same either way. The child and the doll, photographed or described together in that period, look as though they might belong to the same category of thing. They are the same height. They are dressed the same way. The boy named Robert received the doll and named it Robert. He took for himself the name Gene, which was his middle name, and from that point forward was known as Gene Otto. The doll remained Robert. This is a documented fact about the early life of the object and the child, recorded in the histories of the doll and confirmed in accounts that have survived through the decades since. It is the kind of fact that resists easy interpretation. A child who receives an object names it after himself and then renames himself to create a distinction that is not the ordinary behavior of a child receiving an ordinary toy. It is something more deliberate than that, or more instinctive, or something that falls in the space between deliberate and instinctive, where the actions of very young children sometimes live. Gene Otto, from approximately 1904 onward, was a boy who had given his name away to something else and taken a different name in its place. The manufacture of the doll has been attributed broadly to the Steiff Company of Germany. Steiff was founded by Margarete Steiff in the town of Gingen an der Brenz in 1880, and by the early 1900s had become internationally recognized as a producer of high-quality stuffed toys, exporting to markets in Britain, the United States, and across Europe. Margarete Steiff began her work as a seamstress despite having been largely paralyzed from polio in childhood, and the company she built became one of the most respected names in the toy industry of its era. The Steiff workshop in those years was a place of long work tables and careful hands, of half-finished forms waiting for their faces, of cloth and wire armatures, and glass eyes and shallow bowls, and wood shavings swept into corners at the end of the working day. The toys that left those tables crossed oceans in the holds of steamships, ending up in parlors and nurseries in cities whose names would have meant very little to the workers who stitched the seams. The attribution of Robert's manufacture to Steiff is broadly consistent with the type and quality of the object, and with the period in which it would have been produced. There is, however, a specific complication that researchers examining the doll have noted: the absence of the Steiff button identifier on Robert's body. Steiff attached a small metal button to the ear of its finished toys as a mark of authenticity, a practice that became the company's most recognizable quality marker and that survives to the present day. Robert does not have that button, or does not have a confirmed one. Researchers at the Fortis Martello Museum, where the doll has been housed for decades, have documented this absence as an unresolved detail in the doll's provenance. It does not disprove Steiff manufacture. Buttons are lost, buttons are removed. The historical record of any specific toy is incomplete, but it leaves the question open in the way that the question of where Robert actually came from, in a broader sense, has always remained open. The turret room at 534 Eaton Street is on the upper floor of the house, where the roofline narrows into that small tower that is visible from the street below. In Victorian domestic architecture of the kind common in the prosperous southern United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, turret rooms were often used as reading rooms, sitting rooms, or the private retreats of children whose families had enough space to devote an architecturally distinct room to no specific practical function. The room is round, or nearly round, with walls that follow the curve of the tower, and it has a window that faces out over Eaton Street toward the harbor. It is the kind of room that catches light differently from the rectangular rooms below, light coming through a single curved exposure at whatever angle the sun sits in the afternoon sky. It is a room that a child would want to claim. It is a room that once claimed, once furnished with a few specific things, would hold the character of whatever was placed inside it for as long as those things remained there. Jean placed Robert in that room. The doll was given a specific position, a chair, a shelf, a spot near the window, and became a fixture of the turret room in the way that children's objects sometimes become fixtures, present and specific and associated so completely with a particular space that the space without them would feel subtly wrong. The doll was in the turret room. The turret window looked out over Eaton Street. These two facts taken together produced something that was noticed over the years, not just by people inside the house, but by people passing on the street outside. Multiple neighbors and passers-by gave independent accounts of seeing the doll's figure in the turret window at times when no living person was known to be in that part of the house. These accounts are spread across the period of the doll's residence at the Eaton Street home, not a single incident, but a pattern of observations made by different people at different times, each describing the same thing from the same vantage point of a person on the sidewalk looking up. The figure in the window, the white sailor suit, the glass button eyes catching the light. The house, as far as the observer knew or could determine, with its residents elsewhere, its upper floor unoccupied, the turret room behind the glass apparently empty of anyone who might have moved the doll there. The accounts are documented in the historical record of the Robert the Doll case, gathered by researchers and recorded in the materials held by the Fort East Martello Museum and referenced by writers who have examined the legend in depth. They have the quality that external witness accounts often carry in cases like this one. They are independent, they are consistent in their basic description, and they come from people who had no particular reason to fabricate or embellish. A person walking down Eaton Street in the morning and looking up at the turret window is not a person primed to see something unusual. They are simply a person on a street, looking at a house, registering the detail of a figure in a window before moving on with their day. The figure being there when it had not, by any available account, been placed there by a person currently in the room, that is the detail that stayed with them, the detail they mentioned to neighbors, the detail that accumulated across the years into a body of testimony that the house at 534 Eaton Street kept producing. The property at 534 Eaton Street now operates as the Artist House Bed and Breakfast. The building retains its original Victorian architectural character, including the upper floor turret and its window. The turret suite is available for guest bookings, and people who stay there sleep in the room where the doll once sat in its specific position and looked out through the glass at the street below. The floorboards are the same floorboards. The window is the same window. The light in the late afternoon comes through at the same angle it has always come through, falling across the same curved walls, illuminating the same view of Eaton Street that Gene Otto would have seen from that room when he was 4 years old and carrying a doll up the stairs for the first time. There is a particular quality to old houses that have been lived in continuously, a quality that is not supernatural and not explained by any single architectural feature, but simply the accumulated effect of time and occupation and the specific things that happened within a given set of walls. The Artist House has that quality. Its history is documented. Its rooms are knowable. Its bones are the bones of a house built in the Victorian era by a prosperous Florida family with the means to build well and build to last. The turret room is still at the top. The window still faces the street. Whatever occupied that room for the decades when Jean Otto lived in the house, and whatever the neighbors thought they saw in the glass on the afternoons when they happened to look up, is part of the building's record now, not resolved, not fully explained, but present in the way that the history of a place is always present in the physical fact of the place continuing to exist. Jean Otto was 4 years old in 1904, roughly speaking, give or take a year in either direction, depending on which account of the doll's arrival one follows. He was 4 years old, and he was carrying a 40-inch stuffed doll in a white sailor suit up a wooden staircase to the room at the top of his family's house. The doll was almost exactly his height. The doll was dressed as he was dressed. He named the doll after himself and took a new name from his own middle name, creating a distinction between the boy and the object that perhaps served some purpose only a 4-year-old could fully articulate, or perhaps served no articulable purpose at all, and simply happened the way things happen when a child encounters an object and forms an attachment to it that exceeds anything an adult watching from outside the relationship would necessarily expect. The doll went to the turret room. The turret room was at the top of the house. The house was on Eaton Street in Key West, in a city whose harbor was a few blocks away, and whose light came off the water in a way that made everything look slightly older than it was. This is the beginning of the story, and it is also, in the strictest sense, the entire story. A house, a room, a window, and a doll that was given a boy's name by a boy who gave away his own name to accommodate it. What the neighbors saw when they looked up at the turret window, whether they saw the doll sitting in its usual position or the doll appearing to have moved, whether they saw the white of the sailor suit catching the afternoon light, or simply the suggestion of a figure where no figure should have been, that is a question that the accounts document without finally settling. The accounts are consistent. The window was the same window each time. The figure, when it appeared to be there, was where the doll was kept, and the people on the sidewalk, looking up, paused for a moment before continuing down the street, carrying the image with them in the particular way that images stay when they are slightly wrong, when what is seen and what is expected do not quite align. The Steiff workshop in the early years of the 20th century would have produced dozens or hundreds of objects like Robert in any given month, cloth bodies stuffed with excelsior, glass eyes set into hand-stitched faces, small metal buttons attached to ears before the finished toys were boxed and shipped to markets across the world. The workers at those long tables stitched the same forms over and over, varying them within the tolerances of their craft, each one slightly different from the last, in the small ways that handmade things are always slightly different from each other. The toys that left that workshop went to children in New York and London and Buenos Aires and Key West. They went to nurseries and playrooms and the spare rooms of large Victorian houses. Most of them were loved and worn and eventually discarded, or stored in attics and forgotten, or passed between generations until the cloth deteriorated and the stuffing compacted and the glass eyes clouded over with age. One of them went to a turret room in Key West and was given the name of the child who received it. The detail about the name is worth sitting with for a moment, in the unhurried way that small historical facts sometimes deserve. Jean Otto, Robert Otto, before he gave the name away, was not simply a child who received a toy and liked it very much. He was a child who reorganized the terms of his own identity around the arrival of this object. The doll became Robert, the boy became Jean. The distinction was maintained throughout his life. He grew up in that house, left it, trained as a painter, spent years in Paris and New York, and eventually returned to Key West, where he lived again at 534 Eaton Street until his death in 1974. Throughout all of that, the decades of travel and study and artistic work, the years away from Key West, and the years returned to it, the doll in the turret room was Robert. The man was Gene, the name given to the doll at approximately age 4, held for 70 years. This is not a detail that resolves anything. It does not explain the window sightings or the stories that accumulated around the house over the decades. It is simply a fact about a child and a doll, documented and confirmed, that sits at the very center of what the Robert the Doll case is, not the paranormal accounts which belong to their own part of the record, but the plain human strangeness of the attachment itself. The child who looked at a 40-inch stuffed figure in a white sailor suit and decided that the name Robert belonged more properly to the doll than to himself. The house on Eaton Street was built to last, and it has lasted. The turret is still there. The window still looks out over the street. The morning light still comes through the glass at the angle it has always come through, and the afternoon light comes through at a different angle. And on some afternoons, the room catches the last of the day's orange light in the way that rooms at the top of tall houses sometimes do. Guests who stay in the turret suite now sleep in the same curved space where the doll spent most of the 20th century, in a room with the same view and the same boards underfoot, and the quality of continued existence that belongs to places where things happened that were not entirely ordinary. Robert himself is not there. He was moved from the turret room to the Fort East Martello Museum, where he has been housed for decades and where he is visited by people from around the world who have read or heard about the case and made the trip to Key West specifically to stand in front of the sealed glass case and look at the faded sailor suit and the cloth face and the glass button eyes directly. But the Eaton Street house holds the shape of his long residency, the way any house holds the shape of what it has contained, in the proportions of the rooms, in the specific angle of the window, in the particular quality of the light at the top of a Victorian turret on a Key West afternoon. The boy who carried him up the stairs was 4 years old, or thereabouts. The doll was almost exactly his height. They were both wearing sailor suits, or something close enough to sailor suits, that people who saw them together noted the matching, the visual rhyme of the two of them standing side by side in that room that smelled of wood shavings and salt air. The boy said the doll's name was Robert. He said his name was Gene. He took the doll to the turret room and left it there in the way that a child leaves something they trust to remain where they put it, in the way that a child understands that a room and its specific contents belong together and should not be altered. What happened in the turret room over the following years, over the following decades, is documented in accounts that researchers have collected and examined with the careful attention that persistent, unresolved cases tend eventually to attract. The neighbors who looked up at the window, the visitors who heard sounds from the upper floor, the people who came to the house on ordinary business and left with something they found themselves telling other people later, not because they wanted to make a story of it, but because the detail had stayed with them and they had not been able to put it down. All of that belongs to the record of the house and the doll and the years they spent together on Eaton Street. What belongs to this particular moment in the telling is simpler than any of that. A house on a street in Key West in the early years of the 20th century. A room at the top of the house with a window that faces the street. A 40-inch doll in a white sailor suit carried up a wooden staircase by a small boy in a white sailor suit at that approximate hour in the afternoon when the harbor light comes through the glass in long bars and everything in the room catches the warmth of it. The boy's name, from that day forward, was Gene. The doll's name was Robert. The room at the top of the house was where Robert lived, in the particular sense that things live in rooms, seated, still, present, the glass button eyes holding whatever light the window offered, at whatever time of day the light came through. The neighbors who passed on the street below would sometimes look up. The window was there. The room behind it was there, and sometimes on afternoons, when the human occupants of the house were known to be elsewhere, what the neighbors saw in the glass was the small figure of a doll in a white sailor suit, seated in its usual position, present in the way that the doll was always present in that room. Whether the doll had been moved there by someone in the house, or had always been there and was simply noticed at those moments for the first time, or was there in some way that neither of those explanations quite accounts for, that question has stayed open across more than a century. The neighbors who reported seeing it did not offer a resolution. They offered a description: a figure in the window, a white sailor suit, the room apparently empty of anyone who might have placed it there. And then they continued down the street, carrying the image with them, leaving it behind in the way that images settle into the background of a life until they are called up again by someone asking what was there, what was seen, what the window of the turret room contained on those particular afternoons in Key West when the harbor light was right and the house at 534 Eaton Street stood with its upper floor catching the end of the day. The boy who brought Robert to that room gave away his first name to do it. He kept the middle one for himself, wore it for the rest of his life, and went on to become a painter and to live in Paris and to come back to Key West and to the house on Eaton Street and to the doll in the turret room, as though the room and what it contained had always been waiting for his return. The name Robert stayed with the doll. The name Jean stayed with the man. The distinction between them, established in approximately 1904 by a 4-year-old carrying a large stuffed figure up a staircase, held. That is the fact the story begins with, and in some ways the fact the story never quite moves past. A boy who had a name and gave it to something else, a doll that took the name and kept it. The room at the top of the house where the light comes through at the right angle in the late afternoon, and the window that faces the street, and the glass that reflects the sky when the room behind it is dark. The harbor at Key West in the middle of the 19th century was one of the busiest stretches of water in North America. Ships moved through it constantly, salvage vessels returning from reefs, trading schooners working the Caribbean routes, naval supply craft moving between the station and the mainland. The docks smelled of brine and wet rope and the particular sweetness of waterlogged timber drying in the subtropical sun. The city that looked out over all of this, from its low, flat island between the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, was not what most people expected when they thought of Florida. It was not a frontier. It was not a wilderness. It was a wealthy, dense, cosmopolitan port city at the southernmost point of the United States. And for much of the century, it was the wealthiest city per capita in the country, a documented economic fact that has surprised people ever since, because the name Key West does not carry the same weight in American memory as the fortune it once held. The wealth came from water, not from the water itself, exactly, but from what the water took and what skilled crews could recover from it. The practice was called wrecking, licensed maritime salvage, and it operated under a formal regulatory framework that required crews to hold government permits and for recovered cargo to be processed through official admiralty proceedings. When a merchant vessel ran onto one of the reefs that stretch along the Florida Keys like a low submerged wall, wrecking crews from Key West were often the first on the scene. The work was physical and dangerous and extraordinarily profitable in the right circumstances. A single large wreck could yield goods worth tens of thousands of dollars: silk, hardware, furniture, wine, foodstuffs, dry goods, and the revenue from a productive wrecking season moved through the city like a tide, financing the large Victorian homes that lined the main streets and the professional class that occupied them. The harbor at dawn during the wrecking era had the particular quality of a place where serious money was moving, flat light on still water, crews already at work, a quiet efficiency that had the feel of long habit. The sponge industry added another layer. The waters around the quays produced natural sponge in commercial quantities, and harvesting fleets worked the flats with long-handled hooks in boats that became a familiar part of the harbor picture. Cigar manufacturing established itself as a third pillar of the economy, with Cuban immigrants and their families operating workshops where the rolling and cutting and grating of tobacco leaf filled long rooms with the smell of cured leaf and the sound of work. The cigar trade brought the first significant wave of Cuban workers to Key West, and those workers brought their own culture, their own social organizations, their own music and food, and ways of marking time, all of which folded into the existing texture of the city in ways that were not always smooth, but that produced a genuinely distinctive place. A person walking the main streets of Key West in 1880 would have heard Spanish and English alternating in the same block, would have smelled food from different hemispheres cooking through open windows, would have passed churches of different denominations within a few hundred yards of each other, and might have seen on the same afternoon a physician making his rounds, a wrecking captain settling accounts at the Admiralty office, and a sponge boat coming in with its cargo piled at the bow like a strange harvest from another world. Thomas Otto practiced medicine inside this city. His professional standing placed the family among Key West's established households, the kind of household that employed domestic staff, maintained a property of significance, and occupied a position visible enough that what happened within its walls became in time a matter of neighborhood conversation. The house at 534 Eaton Street was not incidental to the story that grew up around it. It was a large Victorian home with the architectural character typical of prosperous Key West construction in that period: high ceilings designed to carry heat upward, wide windows positioned for cross ventilation, a wraparound porch that caught the prevailing breeze from the water, and the upper turret that distinguished it from its neighbors on the street. A physician's household in that city at that time would have been a place of regular movement, patients arriving, neighbors calling, domestic workers coming and going through the kitchen entrance, deliveries of medical supplies and household goods. It would have been a known house, the kind of house whose daily life was observed in the way that the daily life of prominent families in small cities is always observed, with the specific attentiveness of people who live close together and have few reasons not to notice one another. Key West, by the turn of the century, had a population of approximately 18,000 people, a documented figure that places the Eaton Street house within a genuinely urban context, not isolated, not rural, not separated from its neighbors by distance or obscurity, but embedded in a city dense enough that a prominent family's domestic arrangements were fully legible to the street. 18,000 people on a small island is a compressed community. The houses sit close together, the streets are walkable, the same routes are walked daily by the same people who notice without effort what has changed since yesterday. Which window is lit, which door is standing open, which figure can be seen in which upper room. This is worth holding in mind when the accounts of the turret window begin to accumulate. The people who later described what they saw or believed they saw from the street were not strangers passing through. They were neighbors in a city small enough that everyone was, to some degree, a neighbor. The Bahamian community was a significant presence in Key West throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Bahamian immigrants had come to the Keys in substantial numbers across several decades, drawn by the fishing and sponging industries that matched skills already developed in their home islands. They settled in their own neighborhoods, established their own churches and social structures, and maintained cultural practices that had roots in the West African traditions carried through generations of Caribbean life. Those practices were not hidden, they were simply part of the texture of a city that had always contained more cultural layers than its geography might suggest. What mainland Americans tended to group under the labels of hoodoo or voodoo was, in Key West's daily reality, a spectrum of spiritual traditions with specific regional and community distinctions practiced by real people whose religious and cultural lives were as particular and grounded as those of anyone else in the city. Documented historical records of Key West's demographic composition in this period confirm the presence and visibility of these communities and their traditions. They were not marginal to the city. They were woven through it. The Black Floridian community in Key West occupied its own position in the city's social landscape, visible, documented, and navigating the specific constraints of the American South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. With the same combination of community cohesion and cultural vitality that characterized Black life in southern cities of that era. The cultural traditions carried by this community, including spiritual practices with deep roots in West African and Caribbean lineages, existed alongside the Catholic, Protestant, and secular cultures of other Key West residents in a city too small and too interconnected for any community to be entirely invisible to any other. The word hoodoo, when it appears in historical accounts of Key West, refers to a specific set of documented practices with traceable origins, not a vague atmospheric quality, not a shorthand for the foreign or the threatening, but a real body of tradition practiced by real people in a real city, embedded in daily life in ways that left documentary traces in the records that survive. It is into this specific, layered, documented world that the origin story of Robert the Doll must be placed. The most widely circulated version of the story holds that the doll was a gift from a Bahamian or black servant in the Otto household, someone employed in domestic service at the Eaton Street house, who in various tellings either made the doll by hand or presented it to the family's young son. A competing version holds that the doll was purchased by a family member who had traveled to Germany and arrived in Key West as a commercial product made by craftsmen who had never heard of the city it would spend most of its existence in. These two accounts have been documented and discussed in multiple independent historical and paranormal research sources, and neither has been conclusively established as the true one. The question of origin, who gave the doll, where it came from, by whose hands it was first placed into the arms of a child named Jean Otto, remains, as of the time of this narration, genuinely open. That openness is not a failure of research. It is a reflection of the kind of history that gets documented and the kind that does not. The history of a prominent physician's family is the kind that tends to survive in property records, in professional directories, in social notices, in local newspapers, in the accumulated documentation of a household visible enough to leave traces. The history of a domestic servant, their name, their origins, their daily work, the particular things they made or gave, is the kind that tends not to survive, or to survive only in the margins of other records, if it survives at all. If Robert came from a servant's hands, that servant left no confirmed record of having done so. If Robert came from Germany, the specific transaction that brought him across the ocean left no confirmed record either. What survives is the doll itself, and the two stories told about where he came from, and the documented fact that the question has never been resolved. The cultural significance of the Bahamian origin story, the version that places the doll's creation or gifting in the hands of a servant with roots in Caribbean spiritual tradition, has shaped the legend in ways that are worth noticing without insisting on their meaning. The idea that an object might carry within it some quality or intention from the person who made or handled it is not unique to Caribbean tradition, but it has a particular and documented place within the spiritual practices of communities that influenced Key West's cultural life during exactly the period when Robert entered the Otto household. Whether this framework applies to Robert is not a question this narration can answer. What can be said is that the framework exists, that it was present in the city where the story began, and that researchers who have examined the case have noted its presence as part of the documented cultural context, rather than as a confirmed explanation for anything. The cigar workers' Key West, the city that Spanish-speaking Cuban families had built along the western edge of the island, was itself a world with its own internal complexity. The workers who came from Cuba brought with them not only the skills of the cigar trade, but a political culture shaped by the independence movement and a social culture shaped by mutual aid societies, workers' organizations, and a tradition of public reading that hired readers to sit at the front of cigar workshops and read aloud to the workers as they rolled newspapers, novels, political speeches, anything that kept the mind engaged while the hands did their practiced work. This is a detail that has nothing directly to do with Robert the Doll, but it belongs to the world that surrounded the Eaton Street house in the years when Robert arrived there. The city that witnessed whatever happened in that house was a city where people were accustomed to the idea that a single object, a single story, a single presence could carry meaning beyond what was immediately visible. The Victorian home on Eaton Street sat in this city the way all the prominent houses did, visible from the street, its windows readable to anyone who passed, its upper rooms high enough above the ground to be seen from some distance. The turret, which was the highest point of the house, would have been visible from several blocks away in a city this flat and this low. A figure in that window, anything in that window, would have been legible to the street in a way that figures in the upper windows of taller buildings in denser cities would not be. Key West's particular geography, the way its flatness and its maritime position and its compressed urban density made visual information move freely between houses and streets and passing observers, is part of the documented physical context that makes the window accounts worth noting as a distinct body of testimony. The people who described seeing something in the turret window were not glimpsing a distant anomaly across a wide urban landscape. They were seeing what was in a window a few feet above them as they walked a street they walked every day. Thomas Otto's medical practice gave the family a particular kind of legibility in the city. A physician in a small city in 1900 occupied a social position that combined professional authority, intimate knowledge of the community's bodies and ailments, and a steady stream of visitors to the household that blurred the line between the professional and the domestic. Patients came to the house, colleagues visited, neighbors stopped to consult about minor complaints that did not rise to the level of a formal appointment. The household was porous in the way that households organized around professional practice tend to be, and porous households are observed households. What the Otto family experienced inside the Eaton Street house was not contained there. It moved outward, the way things move outward in a small city where the social distances are short and the channels of communication are many. The question of what domestic work looked like in a household of the Otto's position in Key West in the early 1900s is answered in broad terms by what is documented about households of similar standing in similar southern cities of that period. Domestic service was common, essential, and performed largely by black and immigrant workers who occupied a structural position that the historical record documents clearly, even when it leaves individual lives in shadow. Who worked in the Eaton Street house during the years when Robert arrived and when Jean Otto was a small child? Their names, their origins, the specific texture of their daily presence is not established in the sources available. The gap in the record is itself a documented condition of how that period's history was preserved and by whom. The salt air that moved through Key West in the early 1900s carried with it the smell of multiple worlds at once: the harbor, the cigar workshops, the food cooking in Cuban and Bahamian and Floridian kitchens, the tropical vegetation growing in every yard, the specific mineral quality of the reef, and the flat water and the sky that held the heat long after sunset. A child growing up in the Eaton Street house in that period would have grown up inside this atmosphere, inside a city that was, by the standards of American cities of its time, remarkably layered, remarkably interconnected, and remarkably aware of itself as a place where different traditions met and did not always fully separate from one another. That child was Jean Otto, and the object that became most closely associated with Jean Otto's childhood, the doll he named Robert, giving it his own name and taking a new one for himself, arrived into this specific world from one direction or another in circumstances that the record does not fully clarify. The wrecking industry began its decline in the 1870s as improved lighthouse networks and better maritime charts reduced the number of ships running onto the reefs. The sponging industry persisted longer. The cigar trade began shifting northward to Tampa and other cities as labor costs and real estate pressures accumulated. By the time Jean Otto was a child, the wealthiest period of Key West's history was already receding into the past, though the houses and the social structures it had built were still fully present on the ground. The Eaton Street house was a product of that wealthy era, built in the style and at the scale that the wrecking and sponging fortunes had made possible, maintained by a household that still occupied a position of prominence, even as the specific economic engine that had built the neighborhood was cooling. The city in 1904 was still Key West, still dense, still connected to the Caribbean, still defined by water, but it was also a city living with the specific quality of a prosperous past that was beginning to become history rather than present reality. The Bahamian neighborhood in Key West in the early 1900s had the physical character of Caribbean vernacular architecture adapted to Florida conditions. Wooden houses set close together, raised slightly off the ground, their yards containing the plants that Caribbean cooking and folk medicine relied on, grown in clay pots or directly in the soil, labeled by use and tradition rather than by botanical name. Wood smoke from cooking fires, the smell of salt carried on the sea breeze, the sound of voices and music moving through open windows and across short distances between houses. This is what the documentary and photographic record of Key West neighborhoods of that period suggests. It is worth holding this image alongside the image of the Eaton Street house and its turret and its Victorian proportions, because the city that produced the Robert legend contained both of these things within a few blocks of each other, and the relationship between them, the specific texture of proximity between different communities with different traditions in a small, dense, economically stratified city is part of the documented context that no account of the legend can honestly ignore. Whether Robert came from Germany or from the Caribbean, from a shop or from a person whose name the record does not preserve, he arrived in a house that stood at the intersection of all of these things: the wrecking wealth, the medical household, the layered city, the communities whose spiritual traditions were as real and as practiced as anything else happening in Key West at the time. The doll that became the center of one of the most documented and discussed legends in American folklore was not the product of a generic haunted house setting. It emerged from a specific place with specific documented characteristics: a wealthy port city at the edge of the country, connected to the Caribbean in ways that the rest of the United States was not, shaped by the intersection of traditions that the American mainland had largely kept separate, and watched closely enough by its own community that what happened in the turret room of a prominent doctor's house did not stay only in that room. The harbor at Key West is still there. The flat water and the reef and the low sky above the island are the same geography they have always been, though the wrecking ships are long gone and the sponging fleets no longer work the flats. The Victorian houses on the main streets are still standing, most of them, including the one at 534 Eaton Street, with its upper turret and its original architectural character intact. The city that built them, the specific, layered, prosperous, interconnected, Caribbean-facing city of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, exists now mostly in its structures and its records, in the documented history that researchers have compiled, and in the stories that accumulated inside those houses and were carried out into the street. Where Robert actually came from, which version of the origin story is closer to the truth, is a question the available record does not answer. Both possibilities have been documented and examined. Neither has been confirmed. What is confirmed is the world he arrived in, a specific city with specific characteristics, a household with a specific social position, a community with specific ways of watching and noticing and passing along what it saw. The question of origin sits in that world the way an unresolved question sits in any well-documented place, not as an absence that undermines the story, but as an open space within it, a detail that the record has noted and set down without closing. The turret room was there. The city was there. The doll arrived by one route or another into a household embedded in a world far more particular and far more alive than any legend usually carries with it. And whether the hands that first gave Robert to a child were German hands or Caribbean hands, hands trained in a workshop tradition, or hands working from something altogether different, is a distinction that the passing of time has made, for now unanswerable, a thread laid quietly in the record, still waiting, still open, with the same patient quality that the harbor always had when the fleet was out and the water was flat and the day was long and no one had yet seen what the tide would bring back in. A plumber came to the Eaton Street house on an ordinary working day. He had a job to complete, a toolbox to carry in, and no particular reason to notice the doll seated in the chair across the room. The doll was there when he arrived. It was there while he worked. What the plumber told people afterward was that at some point during the afternoon, working with his back to the chair, he became aware that the doll's head had turned to follow him. Not dramatically, not at a great angle, but enough that he was certain the orientation had changed from the one he had noted when he set his toolbox down. He told this to multiple people. He had no prior relationship with the Otto family's domestic stories. He was a man who had come to fix pipes, and what he described was the kind of thing that stays with a person, not because it can be explained, but because it cannot. The account has been cited repeatedly by researchers because of what the plumber was not. He was not a family member with years of accumulated belief in the doll's nature. He was not a guest who had been told the stories in advance and arrived already primed to notice strange things. He was a workman with a job to do, and his account arrived without investment, without the particular quality that attaches to testimony from people who already want to believe. What he reported was specific. The head had moved. He had not moved it. No one else was in the room. That specificity is part of what has given the Eaton Street accounts their persistence. They do not, taken as a body, read like folklore in the usual sense, generalized impressions of unease, vague feelings of being watched, the atmospheric anxiety that attaches to old houses in old stories. The accounts from the Eaton Street home are particular. They describe a specific room, a specific chair, a specific doll, and specific things that doll appeared to do. The turret room, the chair by the window, the small high-pitched sound that seemed to come from behind the closed door on the upper floor, the footsteps on wooden boards that did not match anyone in the household. Gene Otto was an adult man with an established life, a painter of some local reputation, a resident of Key West well known to his neighbors and colleagues. When he gave his most consistent accounts of Robert, he did not frame them as matters of belief. Exactly what he told friends and neighbors was closer to simple statement, that Robert was not a passive object, that the doll had its own will, that this was a fact he had arrived at through long familiarity, rather than through any single alarming event. The accounts from people who knew Gene Otto in his later years describe a man who had lived alongside this belief for decades and wore it lightly, the way a person wears knowledge that has long since stopped being surprising. He had grown accustomed to it. That was how he put it to friends. And he had grown accustomed to the sounds. The sounds were reported by multiple people over multiple years. A small, high-pitched giggling, audible at night, coming from the direction of the turret room, footsteps on the wooden floor of the upper corridor, the particular sound of weight shifting on old boards, in the part of the house where no one was present. Gene Otto reportedly told people he had learned to sleep through these sounds, that they were simply part of the house's character at this point. His wife Anne did not share this accommodation. What the accounts agree on is that Anne Otto found the relationship between her husband and the doll sufficiently disturbing that she insisted Robert be confined to the turret room rather than permitted to occupy the rest of the house. Robert had a room. He stayed in it, or he was found, on some mornings, not in the room where he had been left. That last detail appears in accounts from people who knew Gene Otto personally and reported conversations with him in which he described finding Robert on the landing or at the foot of the staircase, having been left the night before in the chair by the turret window. Gene Otto relayed these discoveries without apparent alarm. He had grown accustomed to Robert's movements in the same way he had grown accustomed to the sounds, as elements of a long familiarity, things that had stopped being extraordinary simply because they had been happening for so long. The tone of the accounts, as reported by friends who heard them firsthand, was matter of fact. He came down in the morning. Robert was on the landing. He went to make coffee. It is worth staying with that quality for a moment, the matter-of-factness of it. The accounts attached to the Eaton Street house do not generally read as accounts of terror. Gene Otto was not a man who described his life in the house as difficult or frightening. He described it as his life, with Robert as part of the texture of it, the way a long familiar noise from the walls becomes the sound of the house, rather than a cause for alarm. The The strangeness had had decades to become ordinary. It had done so, and the result was a body of testimony from the man who knew Robert longest, and most intimately, that is, in some ways more interesting, precisely because it is not dramatic, because it presents the accumulation of strange things without insisting on their significance. The babysitters are a different matter. Several people who were employed to look after the Eaton Street house during the 1970s gave accounts that researchers have noted for two reasons. The accounts predate the period in which Robert became publicly celebrated as a paranormal case, and they come from people with no prior relationship to the Otto family's domestic history, who were left alone in the house for specific periods and returned with specific reports. What they described was consistent across separate interviews conducted at separate times. Robert appearing in a different location from where he had been left. Sounds coming from the turret room when no one was in that part of the house. The sense, persistent and difficult to account for, of being watched, not watched by something threatening, simply watched. The distinction matters. None of the babysitter accounts describe fear in the acute sense, the kind of fear that sends a person running from a room. They describe unease, a particular quality of attention from a direction they could not account for, a doll in a room they were certain they had not entered. The turret room itself appears consistently across the accounts. It is not a large room. It is the kind of room that a Victorian house generates in its upper extremities, contained, shaped by the curve of the architecture, with a window that faces the street below. During the years Robert resided there, the window was the most public face of the room. A person walking along Eaton Street had a direct sight line to the upper window from the pavement. Several people, over several years, looked up at that window and noted what appeared to be a small figure in it, at times when the human occupants of the house were known to be elsewhere. The independence of these accounts is what researchers have returned to repeatedly. They are not accounts generated within the household, filtered through the beliefs of people who already had a relationship with Robert and an established framework for interpreting what they saw. They are accounts from people passing on the pavement, glancing up as people glance at windows, and pausing, not because they had any reason to pause, but because what they saw arrested them momentarily. A small figure in the window. The upper floor of the house dark and quiet. No one on the stairs. The figure sitting exactly as it had been sitting the last time someone looked. It is the independence that gives these accounts their particular weight in the documentary record. A neighbor who passes a house daily develops a casual familiarity with the upper windows, the light in them at certain hours, the absence of light at others, the texture of what can and cannot be seen through glass from the street. Several of the Eaton Street window accounts come from people who passed that stretch of pavement regularly enough to notice a change, to note that something in the upper window was different from the day before, and to look more carefully than they otherwise would. What they reported seeing when they looked carefully was a stuffed doll in a sailor suit sitting in the window of an otherwise unoccupied room. The plumber's account and the window accounts sit in interesting relation to each other. The plumber was inside the house alone, working. The window accounts come from outside the house, from people in passing. Neither group had any reason to produce a false account, and neither group in the documented record claimed any relationship to the other. What they share is the quality of disinterested observation, the testimony of people who were not looking for something strange and found something strange anyway. Researchers have consistently noted this quality when discussing the evidential texture of the Eaton Street case. The accounts most resistant to the usual explanations are not the ones that come from believers. They are the ones that come from plumbers and passers-by. Jean Otto's wife, Anne, is a quieter presence in the accounts than her husband, but she appears in them with enough consistency to constitute her own strand of testimony. She was, by multiple accounts, an intelligent and practical woman who did not share her husband's ease with Robert's presence, and who made specific requests that the doll remain in the turret room, that the relationship between her husband and the doll not extend into the shared spaces of the house, that suggest a considered and deliberate response to something she found genuinely troubling. She did not, as far as the documented record shows, give extensive interviews about her experiences. She did not produce the kind of lengthy first-person account that lends itself to quotation. What survives of her perspective is indirect, relayed through neighbors, through friends of Jean's who noted her position on the matter, through the practical arrangements she insisted upon. Those arrangements are themselves a form of testimony. They tell the story of a woman who drew a line between the doll and the rest of her life, and held that line for as long as she lived in the house. The turret room was the compromise. Robert stayed in it. The door could be closed. The sounds that came from behind the closed door were something Jean accepted and Anne did not, and the arrangement between them reflected that difference without resolving it. Several accounts from people who visited the house during the years Jean and Anne lived there describe being taken upstairs to the turret room as a kind of introduction. Jean opening the door, gesturing toward the doll in the chair, speaking about him in the easy, familiar tone of someone showing a guest something they have long since stopped finding remarkable. The reactions of the guests varied. What did not vary across the accounts was Jean's demeanor, comfortable, unsurprised, the tone of a man in the presence of something he had spent his whole life with. What the body of Eaton Street testimony adds up to, considered as a whole, is not a simple haunting narrative. It is not a story of escalation, of menace building toward crisis, of a household progressively overwhelmed. It is something more patient than that. A long residency, a doll in a chair, a window facing the street, a man who came downstairs some mornings and found Robert somewhere other than where he had been left, and went to make coffee. The strangeness in the Eaton Street accounts has a particular texture, domestic, accumulated, worn smooth by familiarity. It is not the texture of nightmare. It is the texture of something that has been living in the same house with you for so long that you have simply arranged your life around it. The babysitters, again, are the interesting exception because they did not have that familiarity, could not have it, and so encountered whatever the house held without the accommodation that familiarity provides. Their accounts are the accounts of people who met something they had no framework for, without the decades of context that allowed Jean Otto to sleep through the sounds at night. Their unease reads differently from Jean's matter-of-factness. Not more credible, not less, simply differently positioned. They had not grown accustomed. They encountered the sounds and the stillness and the doll in a different location from where they had left it, and they reported what they found without the long domestication of surprise that Jean had undergone. Their accounts are shorter, more fragmented. They carry the quality of something witnessed once, without preparation, and not fully resolved when the evening ended. One particular quality runs through the babysitter accounts that is worth noting. None of them describe Robert as threatening. The sense they report is not the acute fear of something dangerous. It is something more like the persistent awareness of being observed by something that holds very still, that does not speak, that moves or does not move depending on something the observer cannot determine, and that creates, by its simple presence, a quality of attention in the room that is difficult to walk away from and difficult to explain afterward. The accounts converge on this image, a stuffed doll in a chair, or in a location where no stuffed doll should be, in a room that is otherwise quiet and ordinary, generating by its stillness a degree of attention disproportionate to what it visibly is. That quality of disproportionate attention is something that has been noted not just by the babysitters, but by nearly everyone whose accounts survive in the documented record of the Eaton Street house. The plumber, the neighbors at the window, Ann Otto standing at the foot of the staircase with one hand on the newel post, looking up at the closed door. Even Jean Otto, who had accommodated the doll's presence so thoroughly that he spoke of it without drama, gave accounts that suggest he never entirely stopped being aware of Robert in the way that one is aware of something alive, not something threatening, something present. The difference is significant. Alive and threatening are not the same thing. Robert, in the Eaton Street accounts, is consistently described as the former without being described as the latter. The staircase appears in several accounts as a threshold, Ann Otto at its foot, Jean coming down it in the morning to find Robert on the landing, babysitters standing at its bottom, looking up, not going up. It is the kind of detail that accumulates significance, not because anyone has pointed to it as significant, but simply because it appears often enough to become part of the geography of the stories. The staircase separates the part of the house where ordinary life happens from the part of the house where Robert lives. People stand at the bottom of it and look up. They do not always go up. The turret room in the Eaton Street house existed in a Key West neighborhood that was, by the documented accounts of the period, a densely populated and socially interconnected community. The house was not isolated. It was not a remote property at the end of a rural road. It was a prominent Victorian home in the center of an active city, visible from the street, known to its neighbors, passed daily by people who had no reason to notice it, except that they passed it every day. The window accounts are possible because of this proximity, because the house is close enough to the street that a figure in an upper window is visible to a person on the pavement, and because people who pass a house every day develop the casual attentiveness of familiarity. They notice when something is different. Several of them noticed. What they noticed was, by the accounts that survive, consistent in its basic elements, a small figure in the window, the upper floor apparently unoccupied. The figure's stillness, and the stillness's particular quality, the sense that it was the stillness of something watching rather than the stillness of something inert. That distinction is difficult to establish from a distance. The accounts do not claim certainty about it. They claim only that the person on the pavement paused, looked up, and could not immediately continue walking. Something about what they saw arrested them momentarily. Most of them eventually continued down the street. A few of them, by the accounts, went home and told someone what they had seen. The accounts were given without coordination. The people who gave them did not, as far as the documentary record suggests, know each other or know that they were not alone in having noticed. Each of them had a private experience of pausing on the pavement and looking up at the turret window of a house they passed regularly, and each of them went home with something they could not entirely account for. The accumulation of those independent accounts is what researchers have found significant, not any single sighting, which could be dismissed in isolation, but the pattern of multiple unconnected observers noticing the same thing in the same window over the same years. Jean Otto died in 1974. He had lived with Robert for most of his life, from childhood, when the doll arrived at the Eaton Street house, through his education and his years as a painter, through his marriage to Anne, through all the ordinary decades that a human life contains. Robert had been in the turret room for most of those decades. He had been on the landing some mornings. He had been in the turret window when the neighbors looked up. He had been in the chair behind the plumber who came to fix the pipes. He had been wherever he was found by the babysitters who stayed in the house during the 1970s. He had been all of these things, consistently and over a very long period, in a house on a Key West street where the harbor could be heard a few blocks away, and the light off the water came through the same windows it had always come through. The consistency is part of what researchers have returned to when discussing the Eaton Street testimonies as a body. The accounts span several decades. They come from different kinds of people in different kinds of relationships to the house. They do not vary in their central image, a doll in a room, or on a landing, or in a window. What varies is the position, the hour, the specific observation. What does not vary is the doll's presence, which was noted repeatedly and independently by a range of people who had no particular reason to be noting it. That consistency is not proof of anything. It is, as researchers have consistently said when discussing the case, simply the record, the accumulation of observations that has not been satisfactorily explained and has not been discredited. There is a quality to the Eaton Street accounts, held together as a whole, that is worth describing with some care. They do not escalate. They do not build toward a climax. They do not arrive at a single definitive event that explains everything or demands explanation. They are instead a long horizontal record of a particular kind of observation, a doll, a room, a window, a staircase, made by many different people over many years, producing a body of testimony that is consistent in its details without being dramatic in its register. Jean Otto growing accustomed to the sounds, Anne Otto holding the line at the foot of the stairs, babysitters noting the doll's position and the quality of the room's stillness, neighbors pausing on the pavement and looking up. The quality of that record is not what most people expect when they come to the Eaton Street story for the first time. They expect escalation. They expect the account of something that frightened people badly and drove them from the house. What the documentary record contains instead is something quieter and in some ways stranger, a long, patient accumulation of small observations from people who were not frightened, or not exactly frightened, but who noticed something they could not fully account for, and noted it, and went on with their lives. The strangeness of the Eaton Street accounts is not in any single event. It is in the persistence of the pattern, the doll in the window, the doll on the landing, the doll in a different location from where he had been left, the sounds behind the closed door at night, the plumber who came to fix the pipes and went home with something he told multiple people for the rest of his life. Anne Otto at the foot of the turret staircase appears in the accounts often enough to have become something like a recurring image, a woman standing at a threshold, one hand on the newel post, looking up at a closed door. The house is quiet around her in the way that Key West houses are quiet on weekday afternoons when the morning activity has settled and the heat of the day has pressed everything into stillness. The door at the top of the stairs is closed. What is behind it has been behind it for years. She is not afraid of it, exactly. She has arranged her life so that she does not have to think about it too often, and the arrangement has held. But she is standing at the foot of the stairs and looking up, and there is something in the quality of that stillness, hers and the houses and the rooms behind the closed door, that the accounts of people who knew her suggest was never entirely resolved into simple indifference. She had her line, and she held it. The staircase was the line. Robert stayed on his side of it. The turret window, seen from the street below at any hour of the day, has a quality that is difficult to describe without the language of attention. It faces outward. It catches the light. It is at an angle from the street that makes it visible without requiring a person to crane their neck. A casual glance upward is sufficient, and for people who pass the house regularly, that glance became habitual. They looked up. Some of them saw the doll's figure in the glass. Some of them saw nothing. The difference between those two experiences is not something the accounts explain. They simply record what was seen or not seen on the days when someone thought to note it. The window is still there. The house is still on Eaton Street. The boards of the upper floor are the same boards they were when Jean Otto came downstairs in the mornings and found Robert somewhere unexpected. The Eaton Street accounts do not end with an explanation. They end with a death and a transfer and a new family discovering the doll in the turret room and making their own arrangements. But the window remains, and the question of what was or wasn't visible in it on the afternoons when the neighbors paused on the pavement below remains with it, open and unhurried, and not especially demanding of an answer, like a door that was never quite latched, held against its frame by nothing more than the weight of the afternoon settling over a Key West street in the particular way that weight settles when the day has grown very still and the harbor is somewhere nearby, and everything that happened in a house is simply part of what that house has always held. In the turret room at 534 Eaton Street, after Jean Otto died in 1974, the house stood quiet for a time in the particular way that Key West houses stand quiet, the louvered shutters admitting thin lines of afternoon light, the wooden floors holding the heat of decades, the salt air moving through slowly. A new family had purchased the property. They had not purchased Robert. The doll was found in the turret room. He was seated, as he had always been seated, in the position he had occupied for years. The white sailor suit faded, but intact, the cloth face turned toward the window, the glass button eyes open in the direction of the street below. The new family had not been told precisely what to expect. They found him there anyway, in the room at the top of the house, and what followed was not immediate. It unfolded over a period of time, in the gradual way that certain realizations do, quietly and without announcement. Their young daughter, who had been given the turret room as her own, began to report things. She described experiences that disturbed her. She described at various points, and with some consistency, a sense that the doll was not simply a doll, that it moved or watched, or was not always where she had left it. The accounts she gave were those of a child, specific in the way that children are specific, not inflated or elaborated, but simply reported, the way a child reports something that has been happening in the room where she sleeps. The family made arrangements to give Robert away. The Fort East Martello Museum in Key West, which operates under the management of the Key West Art and Historical Society, agreed to receive him. The transfer was not a dramatic event by any external account. It was a practical resolution to a domestic situation that a family had found untenable. A doll, a room, a child who was not comfortable, a decision made. Robert left the Eaton Street house. He left the turret window. He entered, in the custody of a civic institution rather than a private family, a different kind of existence entirely. The Fort East Martello Museum is a brick fortification begun in 1862, part of a coastal defense network intended to protect Key West's naval station during the Civil War. The structure was never completed to its original specifications. It was never used in active combat. Its thick brick walls and interior corridors were built for artillery and garrison soldiers, and then, by a long sequence of circumstances, were repurposed as a museum. Robert arrived there and was given a case. The case is sealed glass. It holds him upright and facing outward, his sailor suit visible through the glass, his cloth face showing the particular darkening that more than a century of age produces in cotton and wool, his glass button eyes positioned so that a person standing directly in front of him meets them at approximately eye level. He does not look like an exhibit. He looks like a doll that has been placed in a case and is waiting, with some patience, for the case to be opened again. The museum's instructions regarding photography of Robert are not printed in small type at the bottom of a standard visitor information card. They are posted clearly, in language that does not apologize for itself. Visitors are told to ask Robert's permission before raising a camera. They are told to wait. They are told that some researchers have described it as a subtle shift in posture, others as a change in the set of the cloth face, others simply as an impression that consent has or has not been offered, may be observable in the interval between the request and the moment of taking the photograph. Proceed, the instruction suggests, only when that impression is one of permission rather than refusal. The practice has no direct equivalent in the standard protocols of any American museum. It is not a performance or a theatrical accommodation. Museum staff describe it as something that has emerged from the accumulated experience of the institution with Robert's presence, a practical response to a pattern they observed and could not explain by other means. The question of what a visitor actually does when standing in front of a sealed glass case containing a cloth doll and asking it to consent to being photographed is in one sense a question about behavior. People do different things. Some ask quietly, under their breath, the words barely formed, and some speak in a normal voice, making the request as straightforwardly as they might make any request in a public space. Some ask more than once. Some stand for a long moment and then put the camera away without using it, having arrived at some personal interpretation of what they encountered in that interval of waiting. Museum staff have noted all of these behaviors. They have also noted that the visitors who skip the request entirely, who raise the camera immediately, or who treat the instruction as an eccentricity they need not accommodate, are disproportionately represented among the people who contact the museum afterward to describe what happened next. What happens next is the subject of the letters. The Fort East Martello Museum has received, over the years since Robert arrived in its care, a substantial accumulation of correspondence from people who believe their interaction with Robert had consequences they did not anticipate. The letters come from around the world. They come on personal stationery and on notebook paper and on the backs of other documents. They come in envelopes with foreign stamps and in envelopes with no return address. They arrive in a steady, unhurried stream, not a flood, not a trickle, but something in between, regular enough that museum staff describe receiving them as an ordinary feature of the institution's correspondence, rather than a rare event. The letters describe misfortune. That is the consistent thread running through them, not a single category of misfortune, not one type of event, but misfortune of the ordinary and various kinds that life produces. Job losses are mentioned frequently. Relationship difficulties appear in many letters, separations, breakdowns, conflicts that arrived without apparent cause and did not resolve. Car accidents are described. Persistent illness is described. There are letters that describe a single event, acute and specific, that the writer dates to a period immediately following a visit to Fort East Martello and a photograph taken without asking. There are letters that describe a long sequence of difficulties, a period of months, an accumulation of things going wrong that the writer has traced back, in their own accounting, to a single afternoon in a Key West museum. The writers do not, for the most part, describe themselves as people who held prior beliefs about haunted objects or animated dolls. Many of the letters contain some version of the phrase, "I know this sounds strange." Many of them begin by acknowledging that the writer is not the kind of person who writes letters to museums about dolls, and then proceed to write the letter anyway because something has happened that they cannot account for by other means, and they have decided, after some internal deliberation, that the accounting they owe is the one the museum's signage described. They are writing to apologize. The apology is the point of the letter. Whatever explanation sits behind the apology, whether the writer believes Robert caused the misfortune, or simply that some protocol was violated and the violation had a cost, or simply that they want to acknowledge what the museum asked them to do and did not do, the apology itself is the consistent element. It is addressed in most cases directly to Robert. The museum is the intermediary. The letter is for him. Some of the letters are brief, a single paragraph, sometimes less, an acknowledgement, a statement of regret, a request for whatever relief or restoration the writer hopes the apology might produce. Some are long, some are very long, multiple pages, densely written, tracing the sequence of events in careful detail, explaining the circumstances of the visit, explaining the circumstances of the photograph, explaining what happened afterward and in what order and with what effect on the writer's life. The handwriting in these longer letters is sometimes steady and sometimes not. A letter written by someone who has spent considerable time composing it, who has drafted it more than once, who has chosen the words, reads differently from one written quickly in a single sitting, and both kinds exist in the Fort East Martello collection. The museum has designated a display area near Robert's exhibit for a curated selection of these letters. The display holds letters from different countries, written in different hands, accumulated across different years. Visitors standing at the display are reading correspondence addressed to a doll in a glass case, apologies from strangers, accounts of misfortune, requests for intercession from a cloth figure in a sailor suit that has been sitting behind sealed glass in a Florida museum for decades. Researchers and journalists who have written about the letter collection have noted that it constitutes, taken together, one of the more unusual secondary attractions at any museum in Florida, and possibly anywhere. It is not presented as evidence of Robert's agency. It is presented as documentation of what people have believed and reported, the letters themselves being the artifact, the genuine, handwritten record of experiences that real people found significant enough to describe in writing and mail to Key West. The question the letters raise and do not answer is what is actually happening when someone stands in front of a sealed glass case containing a 40-inch stuffed doll and experiences what they describe. The museum does not offer an interpretation. Museum staff are not, by institutional mandate, in the business of confirming or denying the claims the letters contain. They receive the letters, they display some of them, they note that the letters continue to arrive. That is the extent of what the institution formally asserts. Paranormal investigators have spent time with Robert in the Fort East Martello Museum and have documented what they describe as anomalous camera behavior in his presence. The accounts are specific: batteries depleted without apparent cause, cameras that had been functioning normally in every other corridor of the museum refused to power on when brought near the case. Photographs taken in the vicinity of Robert's exhibit showed distortions, light anomalies, focal irregularities, unexplained interference in the image, in frames containing Robert that did not appear in frames taken in other parts of the same room. These accounts have been recorded by multiple investigators across different visits and different equipment, a pattern noted by researchers interested in the consistency of reported phenomena across unconnected sources. The skeptical explanation for these phenomena is not difficult to state. Camera malfunctions are common. Battery depletion has environmental causes: temperature, humidity, the electrical conditions of a sealed brick fortification in a coastal climate. Photographic anomalies are produced by dozens of factors that have nothing to do with the subject being photographed. Visitors who have been told the doll is haunted, who have been instructed by museum signage to treat it with a particular kind of deference, who are standing in a room that has been framed as significant, will be primed to notice every environmental irregularity and to interpret it as confirmation of what they already half expect. This is not a weakness of these particular visitors. It is how attention works. A person watching for something will find it in the evidence whether or not the evidence contains it. Researchers working within the paranormal investigation framework offer a response to this. What they point to is the consistency of specific reports across visitors who had no prior contact with each other, who visited on different days, who used different equipment, and who in some cases had not read the museum's literature carefully enough to know what they were supposed to expect. They note that the camera failures are described as occurring specifically near the case and not in adjacent areas of the same building, a geographic specificity that they argue is harder to attribute to general environmental factors. They note that Robert's case, whatever its explanation, has produced a body of reported phenomena that has remained consistent in its general characteristics across decades and across hundreds of independent observers, and that this consistency, whatever it means, is itself worth noting as a factual feature of the record. The museum holds both positions lightly. It is an institution. Its function is to preserve and display objects and the histories attached to them. Robert is an object. His history includes decades of reported phenomena. The museum presents the object and presents the history and leaves the interpretation to the visitor standing in front of the glass. Gene Otto died in 1974. Robert had been his companion, his possession, his declared name-bearer for more than 70 years, from earliest childhood through late adulthood, through a career as an artist, through a marriage, through the long decades of life in the Eaton Street house that the Otto family had occupied since the early years of the century. What Robert was to Gene Otto is not a question that admits of a clean answer. Gene maintained throughout his life that Robert was not simply a toy, not an inert object, not a childhood possession he had retained out of sentiment. He described Robert to friends and neighbors and to anyone who asked as something with its own inner life, its own will, its own responses to circumstance. The relationship Gene had with Robert was, by every account that survives, the most consistent and durable relationship of his life. Anne Otto, Gene's wife, found it difficult. She found it difficult enough that she insisted Robert be confined to the turret room rather than occupying the rest of the house. The confinement did not appear to change what Gene believed about Robert, or what Robert, by Gene's accounting, appeared to do. After Gene died, Robert sat in the turret room. The house passed to new owners. The new owners found him there. The new family's daughter found him there, in the room that had been Gene's room for Robert, and what happened in the months that followed led to the decision that brought Robert to Fort East Martello. The transfer was, by one reading, a practical resolution. By another reading, it was the moment Robert's story moved from private to public, from the domestic interior of a single family's life to the institutional custody of a museum, where anyone could come and stand in front of the case, and where the accumulated testimony of all those visitors would, over time, produce the letter collection and the investigation records and the camera footage and the years of documented reports that now constitute the public record of Robert the Doll. The turret room at 534 Eaton Street is a guest room now. The property operates as the Artist House Bed and Breakfast, and the room at the top of the house, the room with the window that looks down toward the street, the window where independent observers reported seeing a small figure shifting or appearing when no living person was known to be on that floor, is available for booking. Guests sleep there. The original floorboards are still the original floorboards. The window is still the window. Robert is not there. He is at Fort East Martello in the sealed glass case in the room at the end of a corridor in a brick fortification that was built for a war it never fought. What a visitor encounters at the Fort East Martello Museum, standing in front of the case, is a cloth doll in a white sailor suit that is more than a century old. The suit has faded, the cloth face has darkened. The glass button eyes have the quality that old glass eyes have. Not lifeless exactly, but not animated in any mechanical sense, catching the available light at an angle that changes as the viewer moves. The doll is 40 inches tall. It is stuffed with wood shavings. It is seated. It faces outward. It is the same object it has always been. The same object Jean Otto carried up the wooden staircase of the Eaton Street house as a small child. The same object that sat in the turret window for decades while neighbors on the street below reported what they saw in the glass. The object has not changed. The accumulation of attention around it has grown for more than 100 years and shows no sign of contracting. The letters that arrive at the Fort East Martello Museum asking for forgiveness are not addressed to the Key West Art and Historical Society. They are not addressed to the curatorial staff. They are addressed to Robert. The writers, wherever they are, the American Midwest, somewhere in Europe, a city in Australia, a suburb in Canada, are writing to a 40-inch stuffed doll in a sealed glass case in Key West, Florida, asking it to release them from whatever they believe followed them home when they raised a camera without asking. Whether the doll reads the letters or not is not a question the museum has answered. The letters are real. The handwriting is real. The postmarks are real. The misfortune the writers describe was, by their own account, real enough to make them sit down and write. There is something worth staying with in that image, the sheer geographic spread of the correspondence, the fact that people in dozens of countries have had experiences they traced back to a single afternoon in a Florida museum and a single failure to ask a doll for permission. The letters are not the work of a single community or a single cultural tradition. They are not the product of a regional folk belief circulating in one town. They come from people with no prior connection to each other, who visited at different times, who went home to different lives, and who each arrived independently at the same decision to write to Key West and apologize. Museum staff have noted that the letters are still arriving. The collection is not static. It does not represent a closed archive of a phenomenon that peaked at some point in the past and then subsided. Letters arrive after every tourist season. Letters arrive in the slow months. Letters arrive addressed simply to Robert, Key West, Florida, and the Postal Service apparently knows where to deliver them. The glass case holds him in the same position, year after year. The sailor suit is the same sailor suit. The room at Fort East Martello is the same room at the end of the same corridor. The window in the turret room at 534 Eaton Street still faces the street. The letters continue their quiet transit across whatever distances separate the people who write them from the museum that receives them, from cities and suburbs and towns where something went wrong in the weeks following a visit to Key West, from people sitting at tables with notepaper and pens, composing something they have probably not described to anyone else in quite these terms, addressing themselves to an object behind glass in a Florida fortification because addressing themselves there seemed, in their private accounting, like the right thing to do. The display wall near Robert's case holds a curated portion of this correspondence, dozens of letters behind glass, a small fraction of the total collection, representative samples of what arrives. Visitors reading the letters are reading other visitors' accounts of what happened after they left this room. The room that holds Robert's case is simultaneously the room where the experiences reportedly begin, and the room where the written record of their after effects is displayed. The doll and the apologies exist in the same space, separated by decades and distances, and sealed glass, the one utterly still, and the others accumulating steadily around him. What Gene Otto gave the doll, when he named it Robert and took a different name for himself, was something that proved durable past the point of his own life, an identity that persisted through the death of the person who conferred it, through the transfer to a new institution, through decades of new witnesses and new reports and new letters arriving in new envelopes from new places. The doll is still Robert. The house on Eaton Street still has the turret window. The museum in the brick fortification still has the case. The letters are still arriving. The correspondence wall at Fort East Martello is in one sense a record of belief, a collection of documents produced by people who believed something, who acted on that belief by writing, who sent the letter because they thought it mattered, whether or not they apologized. In another sense, it is simply a wall of letters, pages and envelopes and stamps and handwriting, accumulating quietly in the same room where Robert sits behind his sealed glass, facing the same direction he has always faced, the same glass button eyes open in the same light that falls through the same window. The room at the end of the corridor in Fort East Martello is quiet at night after the museum closes. The brick walls hold the day's heat and release it slowly in the dark. The case is sealed. The letters are pinned or arranged behind their own glass, holding still in the same positions they arrived in, each one addressed to the same recipient, each one waiting in its own particular way for something, for acknowledgement, for release, for whatever it is that a person hopes for when they sit down and write an apology to a doll. Whether the doll receives the apologies is not established. Whether the misfortunes described in the letters were caused by anything other than the ordinary workings of a life is not established. Whether the cameras that failed near the case failed for reasons that had anything to do with the case's occupant is not established. What is established is the case itself, the sealed glass, the cloth face turned toward the visitor, the letters still arriving, the wall still growing, the old brick fortification still standing at the edge of Key West's history, with its most visited artifact seated at the end of a corridor in a sailor suit that has not changed in more than a century. That accumulation, the letters from strangers, the photographs that didn't develop, the apologies composed in the small hours in cities, Robert has never visited, sits quietly in the room at Fort East Martello beside the doll who generated it all, the cloth face open and patient, the glass button eyes facing outward in the available light, the stack of correspondence growing by one more letter and then one more, arriving by ordinary post from wherever the last visitor came from, on their way to the wall where all the other letters rest. The brick walls of Fort East Martello have stood at the eastern edge of Key West since 1862, salt-weathered and wide, their Civil War-era masonry absorbing more than a century and a half of Gulf light and Atlantic humidity without much change to their essential character. The fortification was begun by the United States Army as part of a coastal defense network protecting Key West's naval station, a significant strategic position along the Caribbean shipping lanes, and the construction was never completed to its original specifications. The walls went up, the towers were partially raised, the interior spaces were roughed in but never finished to the design that the Army's engineers had drawn, and then the war ended, and the urgency that had driven the project dissolved, and the structure sat in its unfinished state on the eastern shore of the island, too solid to ignore and too incomplete to use as it had been intended. What the Army left behind was eventually put to other purposes. The fortification's thick masonry rooms and its particular quality of enclosure, the way the walls hold the outside world at a slight remove, turned out to be well suited to a museum. The Key West Art and Historical Society took over the management of Fort East Martello and installed within its old defensive walls a collection of artifacts documenting the island's long, layered past, its wrecking economy, its cigar trade, its naval history, the various cultures that had passed through and stayed. The collection grew. Visitors came, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, in a room that a person reaches by walking down a corridor and turning through a doorway, Robert arrived. His case is sealed glass. He faces outward. His sailor suit, faded to an indeterminate pale tone that was probably white at some point many decades ago, is visible through the glass panels, and the cloth of his face, darkened with more than a century of age, slightly asymmetrical in the way that hand-finished objects tend to be, holds whatever expression it has always held, which is not quite an expression in any conventional sense, but is not quite the absence of one either. His glass-button eyes catch the available light at whatever angle the light happens to fall. On an ordinary morning, before the museum has opened, and before any visitors have made their way down the corridor to the room where he sits, he is simply there, unchanged, facing the same direction he faced yesterday and the day before, and for years of days before that. The world that has come to find him at Fort East Martello is larger and stranger and more various than the world that first attached his story to the turret room of a Victorian house on Eaton Street. David the 50th. Sloane arrived at the Robert story in the early 2000s with the methodical interest of someone who understood that the legend had been circulating in Key West for decades without ever being properly set down. The accounts existed, the witnesses existed, or had existed, and some of them were still reachable. The physical locations, the Eaton Street house, the museum, the turret room, were intact and documentable. What the story lacked was the kind of sustained, organized attention that transforms a regional legend into a case with a traceable evidentiary record. Sloane provided that attention. He conducted interviews with Key West residents who had their own connections to the story, with museum staff who had observed visitors' responses to the doll across years of daily contact, and with people who described their own experiences in proximity to Robert. He gathered what the documentary record held. He assembled it into a book-length treatment that became the foundational reference for subsequent researchers, journalists, and documentary producers who came to Key West with cameras and questions. What Sloane's research made available, a body of compiled testimony, a structured account of the legend's history, a set of documented sources that later investigators could trace, was something the case had not previously had. Before the book, the story lived primarily in the memories of Key West residents and in the informal transmission that oral traditions depend on. Someone told someone else, who told someone else, across decades of telling. After the book, the story had an anchor. It could be cited. It could be checked against other sources. It could be used as a starting point rather than reconstructed from scratch each time someone came to investigate. The moment the Robert the Doll legend acquired that kind of documentary foundation was the moment it stopped being a local story and began its much longer journey into the wider world. Fort East Martello itself, the specific physical context in which Robert now lives, carries its own layer of accumulated history that sits beneath the doll's story without overwhelming it. The 1862 construction date places the fort's origins in the first year of the Civil War, a conflict whose consequences for Key West were particular and complex in ways that the island's position made inevitable. Key West remained under Union control throughout the war, its naval station operating without interruption, the fort's unfinished walls a physical record of priorities that shifted before the project could be completed. The rooms that now hold museum collections were designed to hold something else entirely. The corridors that visitors walk through to reach Robert's case were laid out for military purposes that the fort was never actually called upon to serve. There is something in that history, the structure built for one purpose, used for another, housing at its center an object that has accumulated its own contested record, that sits quietly alongside everything else the fort contains. The corridor that leads to Robert's room is worth describing simply as a corridor. Brick walls, a measured width, the particular acoustic quality of enclosed masonry spaces that makes sounds behave in ways that are slightly different from how they behave in open air. Visitors walking that corridor carry their cameras and their awareness that they are approaching something they have read about, or heard about, or seen discussed on a screen at some distance from Key West. The anticipation is part of the experience now, inseparable from the experience, in a way that would have been impossible to predict when the doll first arrived at the museum in the years following Gene Otto's death in 1974. The Robert who sits in his glass case today is not only the stuffed figure that was made in the early 1900s and given to a child in a Victorian house on Eaton Street. He is also the accumulated weight of everything that has been said and written and filmed about him across more than 5 decades of public attention. The connection that paranormal journalism and popular culture retrospectives have drawn between Robert the Doll and the 1988 horror film Child's Play is one of the more persistently cited threads in the wider story of the legend's passage into popular culture. The film, written by Don Mancini, centers on a doll, a mass-market children's toy that becomes the vessel for a murderous human consciousness transferred into the object before death, animating the doll with an autonomous and dangerous inner life that its young owner is the first to recognize as real. The conceptual parallels between that premise and the documented claims attached to Robert, a doll believed by its owner and by independent witnesses to have an autonomous inner life associated with phenomena that its observers described as evidence of will and agency, are the parallels most commonly cited when discussing the relationship between the real object and the fictional one. Don Mancini has discussed the influences on Child's Play in various interviews over the years, and the connection to Robert has been taken up in horror film scholarship, paranormal journalism, and popular culture retrospectives in ways that are now difficult to fully disentangle from one another. What can be said with reasonable accuracy is that the conceptual territory the film occupies, a vintage, beloved object inhabited by something that moves through the world with its own intentions, is territory that the Robert the Doll legend had been mapping for decades before the film was made. Whether the specific legend directly shaped the specific film is a question the documentary record does not conclusively settle. That both the legend and the film reached large audiences, and that those audiences increasingly encountered one in the context of the other is a fact the record does hold. The Ghost Adventures episodes filmed at Fort East Martello brought investigative television crews and their equipment to Robert's case and produced material that was subsequently viewed by audiences numbering in the millions. The format of those episodes: investigators moving through a location after hours, deploying various instruments to measure anomalies, speaking to any presence they believe may be listening, placed Robert within a recognizable contemporary vocabulary for engaging with reported haunted objects. Viewers who came to Robert through that programming arrived with a specific set of expectations shaped by the format and the case's documented history, its layers of independent witness testimony, its accumulated correspondence, its physical continuity across more than a century, gave those expectations material to work with. The episodes were consistently ranked among the most discussed entries in their respective series. The discussion they generated spread across online forums, social media platforms, and personal conversations in which people who had never been to Key West described their own responses to what they had seen on screen. Some of those people subsequently made their way to Fort East Martello in person, walking the corridor to Robert's room with the specific awareness of having already encountered his image in a context designed to heighten whatever it was they were carrying toward the glass case. The museum's visitor numbers reflect, in some traceable way, the reach of that programming, a relationship between documentary television and heritage tourism that is not unique to Fort East Martello, but that finds at Fort East Martello a particularly clear example. Within the vocabulary that paranormal researchers use to organize their investigations and classify the objects and locations they study, Robert occupies a specific categorical position. The classification is spirit-attached object or focal object, terminology that refers to physical items around which reported anomalous phenomena appear to cluster across multiple witnesses and over extended periods of time. The case for placing Robert in this category rests primarily on the consistency of reported phenomena across witnesses who had no prior knowledge of one another and no common interest in producing corroborating accounts. The plumber who described the doll's head rotating, and the babysitters who arrived without prior investment in the family's domestic history, the neighbors who gave accounts of the figure in the turret window without coordinating their observations, the museum visitors who described camera failures in proximity to the case while reporting normal function in other rooms, investigators who argue for the focal object classification point to what they describe as the geographic specificity of the reported effects, phenomena that appear strongest in direct proximity to the doll and diminish as distance from the object increases, as a distinguishing feature that separates the case from more diffuse environmental anomaly. The argument is that a haunted house, in the conventional sense, distributes its reported phenomena across the full volume of a building and its grounds. A focal object concentrates the reported phenomena in a radius around a specific physical item that can be moved from location to location without altering the character of the experiences associated with it. Robert moved from the Eaton Street house to the Fort East Martello Museum, and the reported phenomena moved with him. That portability, investigators note, is part of what makes the case worth sustained attention. Skeptical researchers occupy a different position on the same terrain. The explanation most frequently offered from the skeptical side involves suggestion, the well-documented human tendency to perceive anomaly in ambiguous situations when an expectation of anomaly has already been established. A visitor who walks into Robert's room at Fort East Martello, knowing that they are in the presence of an object with a long history of reported phenomena, will arrive already primed to notice anything that could be interpreted as confirmation. A camera that malfunctions near the glass case for a visitor in that state of heightened attention carries a significance it would not carry if it malfunctioned in a grocery store parking lot. The same physical event produces different cognitive weight depending on the interpretive frame already in place. The related mechanism that skeptical researchers invoke is agent detection, a cognitive tendency that evolutionary psychologists have described as the tendency to attribute intention and agency to phenomena that are actually the products of chance or environmental factors. Human beings are, by this account, systematically prone to perceiving will and purpose in events that contain neither. A doll seated in a particular position, encountered in a context that encourages the perception of autonomous movement, will produce in some observers the impression that it has moved. The impression is genuine. The movement may not be. Both things can be true simultaneously, and the case for either interpretation does not establish the case against the other. What neither the focal object classification nor the agent detection hypothesis fully accounts for is the cumulative weight of the body of testimony that Robert's case has generated across more than a century. Not every witness arrived in a context of established expectation. The plumber had a job to do. The neighbors walking past the Eaton Street house were not, on ordinary afternoons, in a state of heightened paranormal attention. The babysitters were employed to look after children, not to investigate a legend. The consistency of the accounts across these varied circumstances, the specific details that recur without having been coordinated, is the aspect of the case that researchers on both sides of the classification question tend to find most resistant to a clean resolution. The taxonomy of haunted objects is a category with other notable entries, and Robert's position within it has been compared to cases involving other physical items that have accumulated similar bodies of associated testimony. Those comparisons are part of how the case is situated within the broader field of paranormal research, not as an isolated anomaly, but as an instance of a documented type, sharing certain structural features with other cases, while differing in the specifics of its history and the character of the phenomena reported. The comparisons do not resolve any of the central questions. They place the questions within a context that makes them tractable as research problems, rather than dismissible as the isolated eccentricities of a single Key West family. Robert's passage through that research context has carried him considerably farther from the turret room on Eaton Street than the stuffed figure of cloth and wood shavings would seem to warrant a journey of the documented body of testimony around him, compiled across independent researchers, filmed across documentary productions, written about in books and articles, and online accounts that continue to be produced, has given the case a durability that most legends, however vivid in their moment of origin, do not achieve. Legends typically lose texture as they age, details blur. The specific individuals involved become types. The location becomes generic. What happened to the Robert legend is something closer to the opposite. As more researchers applied more attention to the case, the specific details became more vivid rather than less. The individual witnesses became more particular rather than more general. The location became more documentably itself, rather than fading into a generic haunted house. Part of what makes that quality possible is the physical continuity of the objects and places involved. Robert himself is still the same stuffed figure that was given to a child in Key West in the early 1900s. His glass button eyes, his faded sailor suit, the wood shavings inside him that give him his particular weight and resistance when he is handled, these are the same materials that the original object was made from. He has not been replaced or replicated. He has not been allowed to deteriorate beyond recognition. He is the thing he has always been, aging at the pace that cloth and wood shavings age, present in a sealed glass case at the end of a corridor in a Civil War-era brick fortification on the eastern shore of Key West. The Eaton Street house is also still there. The turret room is still there. The window that faces the street, the window from which multiple independent witnesses reported seeing a small figure when no human occupant of the house was known to be in that part of the building, still faces the street in the same direction it has always faced. Guests who book the turret suite at the Artist House Bed and Breakfast sleep in the same room where the accounts accumulated across decades. The floorboards are the same floorboards. The curve of the turret wall is the same curve. The window is the same glass, set in the same frame, and what appears in it or does not appear in it on any given night is as open a question as it has always been. That quality of physical persistence, the doll still existing, the house still standing, the room still bookable, the corridor at Fort East Martello still leadable to the room where the case sits, is part of what distinguishes the Robert story from legends that survive only in texts and oral tradition. The physical anchors are still in place. A person can go to Key West and stand in front of the glass case and look at the same object that the plumber looked at, that Gene Otto's neighbors looked at when they glanced up at the turret window, that the babysitters looked at in the rooms of the Eaton Street house in the 1970s. The looking is available. What the looking produces, what any given person standing in front of the sealed glass on an ordinary afternoon takes away from the experience of meeting Robert's glass button eyes directly, is a question that each person who makes the walk down the corridor has to answer or decline to answer for themselves. The letters continue to arrive. Museum staff at Fort East Martello have confirmed that the correspondence from former visitors who believe they photographed Robert without permission and subsequently experienced misfortune arrives regularly from destinations around the world, written in various languages, on various kinds of paper, in handwriting that ranges from neat and controlled to visibly distressed. The letters do not arrive at a rate that suggests the belief is narrowing or losing its hold on the people who hold it. They arrive with the regularity of a correspondence that has found its address and knows where to go. Museum staff handle the arrivals and add them to the collection and go on with the ordinary work of running a museum, and the stack grows. What the letters represent as a body of material is something that does not have a clean analog in the standard operations of American museums. Museums receive donations, they receive requests, they receive criticism and appreciation, and occasionally threats. They do not typically receive, on a regular basis, personal letters from people in other countries describing how their luck changed after a visit, how the car accident happened, how the relationship ended, how the illness arrived, and asking the doll in the glass case to release whatever hold they believe it has taken on them. The Fort East Martello Museum holds this unusual position in the landscape of American cultural institutions, and the staff who work within that position have developed over time a matter-of-fact relationship with the unusual that seems entirely appropriate to the environment. The practice of asking Robert's permission before raising a camera, verbally requesting consent from the doll, waiting for some perceived signal, proceeding only when that signal has been received, continues to be observed by visitors and continues to be encouraged by museum staff and signage. Whether any given visitor observes the practice with full sincerity or with the kind of playful half-belief that cultural rituals often attract, or with the ironic distance of someone going through a motion they do not endorse but find interesting to perform. The practice itself has acquired the durability of an institution. It is part of what happens at Fort East Martello. It is part of what people describe to others when they come back from Key West and someone asks what they saw. The durability of the practice, the fact that it continues to be observed, that new visitors continue to be instructed in it, that the instruction continues to produce in some visitors something more than performance, is part of the texture of the case at its present stage. Robert has been in the museum for longer than he was in the Eaton Street house. The documentation around him has continued to accumulate throughout that time. The audiences who know about him have continued to expand. And through all of it, the doll has occupied the same position in the same glass case, facing the same direction, holding the same expression, the same glass button eyes, catching the same quality of light that falls through the museum's windows at whatever time of day the light happens to fall. There is something in the persistence of the case, the way it has continued to generate new testimony, new attention, new discussion, without arriving at a resolution that would make the new testimony unnecessary, that sits comfortably within the wider frame of cases that have not been explained, not because the explanation is being withheld, not because researchers have failed to apply sufficient effort, but because the case in its honest dimensions contains something that the available explanatory frameworks do not fully account for, and the honest acknowledgement of that gap is in the end what keeps the case alive and what makes the corridor at Fort East Martello worth walking. The brick walls of the fort absorb the day's heat slowly and release it slowly. The Gulf light outside the museum's windows shifts through its ordinary progressions, morning to midday to afternoon, to the particular quality of Key West evening light that has a warmth and a softness that is partly the latitude and partly the proximity to water and partly something harder to name. Inside the museum, the light is steadier. The air is conditioned to a temperature that preserves the artifacts. The objects in their cases are in the same positions they were in when the museum opened this morning, and they will be in those same positions when the museum closes this evening and when it opens again tomorrow. Robert is in the same position. His glass button eyes are facing the same direction. His sailor suit, faded and real, and more than 100 years old, is the same sailor suit it was when the first accounts began accumulating around the boy who wore a matching one and called the doll by his own name, as though the name were something that could be given away and kept at the same time. The legend went out from a turret room on Eaton Street and moved through the world, through David Sloan's carefully compiled interviews, through the Ghost Adventures episodes, watched on laptops in rooms far from Key West, through horror film scholarship and paranormal research taxonomy, and the handwritten letters that arrive from places the museum staff recognize by their postmarks, and some they have to look up. The legend covered distance that a stuffed figure in a sealed glass case cannot cover on its own. And then the legend came back, as it always does, to the specific weight of the specific object in the specific case at the end of the specific corridor, where the brick walls hold the outside world at a slight remove, and the light falls through the glass in the same way it has fallen for years. The museum will open tomorrow. The corridor will fill with the particular sound of visitors moving through a masonry building in a warm climate, footsteps carrying differently in brick than in wood, the soft sound of voices held at the volume people use when they are in the presence of something they are not entirely sure how to address. Some of those visitors will raise their cameras. Some will ask permission first. Some will lower their cameras again before taking the photograph and think about it and raise them again, and in the moment before the shutter opens, stand in the particular stillness of someone who is not quite sure what they are doing and cannot entirely explain why they are doing it. Robert will be facing outward. The glass case will be sealed. His cloth face will be as it has always been, darkened with age, slightly asymmetrical, neither fully expressing nor fully withholding whatever quality it is that has drawn people down that corridor for decades. And his glass button eyes will hold the light. The letters are still arriving at the front desk from addresses around the world in handwriting that covers a range from careful to urgent, from people who believe they owe an explanation and hope that an explanation will be enough. Outside the fort's walls, the Gulf light does what Gulf light does in the late afternoon, softens at its edges, loses the sharpness of midday, turns the water at the shore a color that has no single name. The island carries on with its afternoon in the way that Key West afternoons carry on, the shade of the palms moving slightly, the heat still present but no longer insistent, the particular quality of light that falls on old wood and old brick and old harbor water and makes them all look like versions of the same thing. The sealed glass case holds the same object it has always held. The corridor holds the same quiet it holds between visitors.